Good morning. Hello. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. On behalf of Friends of the National World War II Memorial, I extend our heartfelt thanks to Lieutenant General Plain and General Seeley and the National Defense University for generously hosting today's 12th annual Haydn Williams World War II Memorial Legacy Lecture. As chair of Friends, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Dr. John C. McManus. Dr. McManus is one of America's leading military historians. His scholarly contributions to our understanding of the American military, particularly through his many acclaimed works on World War II, are invaluable. Dr. McManus's latest monumental project, a 3-volume history of the U.S. Army in the Pacific and Asia theaters during World War II, has solidified his place as a foremost authority on the Pacific War. This powerful trilogy offers a deeply researched, comprehensive, and moving look at the Army's critical role in the theater. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John C. McManus.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Jane. I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today, for inviting me. What an honor it is to give the Haydn Williams lecture. Thank all the folks from the World War II Memorial, Friends of the World War II Memorial, and the National Defense University and the General. Thank you so much, all of you. What an honor it is to be here today. So I'd like to take you into the world of the United States Army in the Pacific Asia Theater, 1945, give you a sense of what that is like. And maybe some lessons to be learned, some of the personalities involved, some of the pitfalls and the difficulties, because it is an extremely tenacious fight that is going on at that point. So as 1945 dawns, the United States Army had become what I would argue at that point is really one of the leading military organizations on the planet. And it had really mastered a lot of sophisticated elements of warfare. It's operating. If we sort of think ahead, you look at this part of the globe. This is like 1/3 of the world's surface of ocean and continent and islands. And so the Army is operating from the choking jungles of Burma to the Solomon Islands to desolate outposts in Alaska. To the hills of Leyte and many, many anonymous places throughout the South Pacific and the Central Pacific. And by this point, the Army has done the vast majority of the ground fighting in the war against Japan, and it is going to do so throughout much of 1945. So how many soldiers are there at this stage? At this point, there's about 1.4 million Army ground soldiers serving somewhere on our map. It is, of course, such an enormous force and such a dispersion of geography that there's no way you could have this force under one commander. And of course, just the way the theater is divided represents a compromise between the Army and the Navy, because neither felt that it was appropriate to basically submit to the ultimate authority of the other. So the Army itself, those 1.4 million, are not serving under one distinct commander. And of course, it has this Army force, if we think of it as such, has matured into an incredibly sophisticated land force. And as I said, I would argue among the most sophisticated in human history. In the course of the war, about 1.8 million ground soldiers are going to serve, Army ground soldiers are going to serve somewhere in the war against Japan. 1.8 million. To give you a sense of perspective from American history, that is the 3rd largest land force ever sent overseas to fight a war by the United States, behind only the World Wars I and II Army in the European theater. So you're talking about a force of this size involving this many people. It's an enormously large human story. It had grown, the Army had by 1945, by the end of the war, to comprise some 21 infantry and airborne divisions. Yes, there were paratroopers in the Pacific. I think we tend to forget that. And, assorted independent combat teams, engineer special brigades, regimental combat teams, tank battalions, and such that I would argue comprise another 3 to 4 divisions worth of manpower. So this is in addition, of course, to all the supporting service forces and whatever else you've got in order that has to be there to keep this combat force in the field. And by the way, these numbers I'm giving you does not include the Army Air Forces. Of course, the Air Force was part of the Army back in World War II. So those numbers I'm giving you doesn't even include the Army Air Force. That's just Army ground soldiers. The size of the Army and theater absolutely dwarfed the size of the Marine Corps, and yet one of the things that struck me as an historian, our popular memory of World War II and the Pacific Asia theater, and particularly the ground fighting, almost entirely centers around the experience of the Marines. And yet the Marines mobilized 6 divisions. It was the largest the Marine Corps had ever been, in World War II. And so it's actually the Army, not the Marine Corps, that's carrying out most of the amphibious landings. The Marines carried out 15 in the course of the war. The Army, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone carried out 35 just in the spring of 1945. And the Army as a whole, you're talking about low triple figures. So my purpose in pointing this out, especially as I see many beautiful forest green Marine uniforms here, and of course General Seeley, is not to denigrate the Marine Corps. I want to make that very clear. My purpose is actually otherwise, that when you get a sense of that larger perspective, you realize how the Marine Corps was incredibly punching above its weight. And the kind of impact and, of course, the valor unquestioned of the Marine Corps in the war against Japan. In fact, so much so that it sticks with us as the popular memory of the whole war. These iconic images of Iwo Jima, so on and so forth. My purpose, then, is not to denigrate the contribution of the Marines, but actually to laud the contribution of the Marines, but to make the point that the 2 ground-oriented services had to fight together, and that one of them was much larger than the other, and thus is going to tend to do more fighting, and by design is going to be doing a lot of the support role as well. That is important to remember as well, because the Marines weren't necessarily designed for that. So nearly 42,000 of these soldiers would not survive, felled by combat, disease, accidents, the terrible privation of captivity. The vast majority of American service personnel who were captured by the Japanese in the war were Army soldiers, Army ground soldiers in particular. This was a harvest of death that totaled more than the entirety of any previous American conflict, except for, of course, the Civil War and World War I. So you think about that perspective for a second, too. Just Army deaths in the war against Japan is larger than most of our previous wars up to that point in time. So it's a staggeringly complex military force. It's got vast capabilities seldom seen in the course of human events, and I'll just give you a few examples here. Diplomacy and joint operations with allies. This is an alliance war, a coalition war. The last time the United States fought a war of any size and consequence without nationalistic allies was the Spanish-American War in 1898. Okay, so a war alongside the British, alongside the Chinese, alongside the Australians, the New Zealanders, alongside, of course, Filipinos in the Philippines campaign, and, of course, all sorts of different Pacific Island peoples. I mean, you name it. There's a lot of diplomacy happening here that is very, very relevant. Inter-service coordination, particularly Army-Navy coordination. You take one glance at the map, you're not going anywhere without the Navy. And it is a maritime war to a great extent. So how do you figure that out? How do you combine staffs? How do you figure out an amphibious operation? How do you figure out loading plans? How do you meld together your own operational orders and the various needs of the services? What do you do about that? Of course, the Army had to get very good at that by 1945. Engineering. This is an engineer's war on so many levels. There's no infrastructure in so many of these places. You have to create it out of whole cloth. You've got to plan it. You've got to supply it. Okay, it's a logistician's war too, obviously, and the Army is a huge part of that. And the Engineers' War, in terms of the building projects that are going to be going on, not to mention, of course, the traditional, mining and dealing with booby traps role and all of this kind of stuff. The engineering side of the Army is absolutely massive and incredibly complex. Transportation. Of course, the Army's Ground Transportation Corps, in terms of the vehicles that are going to be involved, moving stuff from to and fro, but also water transportation. The Army has a Navy during World War II, and that's the sort of interesting wrinkle of this. The Navy's so overstretched that it's okay with the idea of the Army having boats in order to have small amounts of shipping move stuff to and fro. Civil affairs, especially in the Philippines, where you're working with locals and figuring out the local political situation and helping and caring for locals. It's a humanitarian operation, depending on where we're talking about at any given time. You've got medical care on a scale unimaginable even a generation earlier. Just operating in this theater presents so many challenges for guys like these. Just being able to survive, being attacked by so many different diseases, operating in a difficult environment. The medical care for combat wounded, of course, how to transport, how to treat. The commitment to medical care, which is really more than anything an Army thing, is absolutely massive. And of course, by the way, ground combat operations of every type fought in some of the world's most inhospitable locales against a foe who recognized few Western-style rules of warfare. And I would submit to you that that is a harbinger. The Japanese were not signatories to the 1929 Geneva Convention, and they did not fight the way the Americans felt was within the proper rules of warfare to fight. So in other words, the medics I just talked about, the Japanese are deliberately trying to kill them and so on and so forth. And the Americans then have to decide, how do we fight? What rules do we observe, if any? Do we fight the same way? And of course, that's really been, to some extent, what we've dealt with ever since. So in studying the war against Japan, I think there's much more harbingers for the future than the European theater in the war against Germany, when Germans at least sometimes followed some semblance of rules. You see a kind of kill or be killed kind of savagery to the Pacific Asia War, which is why sometimes it's very uncomfortable to remember. There's a lot of legacies in there. So the soldiers of this Army, and of course their opponents, had already determined that scruples mattered much less than victory and survival. This was the reality of the situation. And, they're also seeing fighting in a place on the planet that is really going to be, to some extent, the long-term future of the United States, Asia, and the Pacific Rim. With the exception of Grenada, Panama, and Mogadishu, pretty much every American war since World War II has been fought somewhere in the Asian landmass. And, by the way, ground fighting has accounted for something in the order of about 90% of American war deaths in that time frame, at the very time when you've had these giant leaps, of course, in technological power, sea power, air power, cyber power, on and on and on it goes, that was supposed to make ground combat obsolete. Instead, weirdly, the opposite has tended to happen, and I think World War II in the Pacific gives us a little bit of a glimpse into that. So 90% of our deaths happening in ground fighting, and of course most of that is, you guessed it, by Army soldiers. Now, I don't propose to walk you through the entire Army experience in 1945 in the Pacific. For that, you have to, of course, buy my book and read it. I hear it's really good, and I totally recommend it to you. It's amazing. You'll love it. You won't regret it. I just want to give you a kind of a highlight version of this, and of course, I hope leave plenty of time for your questions too, which is, I think, sort of the purpose of being here on some level. So let's just start with some of the key personalities. And when we talk about the Army in the Pacific, we've got to talk about the great Zeus of the theater, certainly as he would have seen himself. This is Douglas MacArthur, and if you're really looking closely, you'll notice he's got 5 stars on his lapels. Now that dates the picture then, doesn't it? This is not from earlier in the war. He's promoted in mid-December 1944 to 5-star. And, of course, by then, he had obviously had a lot of experiences leading soldiers in the war against Japan. What's unique about MacArthur versus many of his colleagues, really all of his colleagues, is that he had once been chief of staff of the Army in the 1930s, of course. And then now in this war, he's a theater commander, which technically is a step down, but certainly he would not have seen it that way. I like to say on a good day, MacArthur's ego might have fit into the Grand Canyon, possibly, a very tight fit. Certainly a vainglorious and egomaniacal kind of personality at times, but also very thoughtful. Quite intellectually brilliant on many levels, courageous to a fault. So he's just staggeringly complex. And by 1945, he's on the eve of on the cusp of liberating a place that he thought of as home, Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines. So he's kind of complex to the point of convolution. A close aide once said of him, "None of us really knew MacArthur. We all saw fragments of the man." And I think this is so true. He's remarkably courageous, as I mentioned. He's epically conniving, as I didn't mention. He believes with almost evangelical intensity that America's future lay in the Pacific and Asia. And I think subsequent history has proven that there's a great element of truth to that. And it doesn't mean America's future wasn't in Europe as well, but that I think it's an also kind of thing. And I think he felt this was de-emphasized in American policy. Okay, so he as Lieutenant Colonel Dusty Rhodes, his pilot, who spent as much time with him in this time frame as any, he said he had some feeling that he was a man of destiny. He seemed to believe that he was especially protected so that he could fulfill a mission. And what was that mission? Of course, the liberation of the Philippines, which he saw as a modern crusade. In fact, crusade is probably too small a word for how MacArthur saw this. Redemption maybe is another word too. And so he had argued, of course, quite famously and vociferously for an American return to the Philippines as just, something that we simply had to do. And that if we didn't, it would be an appalling breach of faith, he felt, with the Filipinos. But I would also say, too, he thought of the Philippines, especially Luzon and Manila, as home because he had lived there. And he loved the people of the archipelago. And so this, there were some who even joked that he really wanted to liberate the Philippines more than defeat Japan on some levels. And I think, it's kind of an interesting wrinkle because you wonder what he felt when push comes to shove. So he has two key guys to carry out his designs. He's got two armies under his command. So he's a theater commander at this stage. It's called Southwest Pacific Area, or SWAPA. And he's got two armies, 6th Army and 8th Army under his command, and thus two key guys in command of those armies. So the first one, the guy you see on the left there, is Lieutenant General Walter Kruger. Now he's standing with Vice Admiral Tommy Kincaid, who by this point had worked very closely with MacArthur. MacArthur, to his credit, had really consummated very productive, positive, useful relationships with his naval colleagues. Also, Rear Admiral Daniel Barbet was another naval officer he works closely with, but Kincaid was one of the highest-ranking officers. More famously, of course, William Bull Halsey is going to work closely with MacArthur as well. And by the way, their fathers knew each other, and so there was a kind of a family continuum there too. So there's Kincaid standing with Walter Kruger, who commanded 6th Army. And I think Kruger's background is just so fascinating. He is the classic example of a self-made person. He had actually been born in Germany, not in the United States. His father was a German army officer, and he died when Walter was a child. So as an adolescent, Kruger was an only child. So as an adolescent, his mother packed him up, and they emigrated to the United States. Interesting enough for me, I come from St. Louis, Missouri. That's where they went. And the reason was it was a major German-American community then as now in my hometown of St. Louis. And so they come there to settle in. So imagine what this means for him, learning a new culture, a new language, adjusting to a new country without his father, the pressure on his mother. All of that is happening. And so Kruger really, transitions very, very well. He was very proud that he spoke English with nary a trace of an accent for the rest of his life. So he spoke German, English, Spanish, French. It was just really quite remarkable. And in 1898, when I mentioned the Spanish-American War, Walter was 17, and he decided, you know what, I want to be part of that, and he joins the Army as a private. So he joins the Army as a private in 1898, and about a half century later, he retires as a 4-star general. And that's probably not going to happen again in the future. But I'll tell you what else won't happen again. I mean, yes, he's a natural soldier. He works his way up through the NCO ranks. He gets commissioned from the ranks in the Philippines when he's serving there early 20th century. But the other thing that won't happen, I mean, he ends up as a 4-star, and of course, many of his peers have a West Point pedigree. He doesn't have that. He doesn't have a college degree, but he also doesn't have a high school diploma. And that's what I'm saying. That definitely won't happen again, that you have a 4-star without a high school diploma. So this is an autodidact. This is someone who's self-taught. This is a natural soldier. And the interesting thing is, by the time he's like a field grade, he's writing these wonky, like military intellectual papers, publishing these articles that kind of blow his colleagues away on some level. So he's a military thinker too, not just a field soldier. But the interesting thing about Kruger and his career, he never loses touch with the common soldier because he had been one. And he always had that feel, that soft spot in his heart for enlisted. Where he didn't have a soft spot was for many of his fellows in the officer corps. So Walter Kruger was someone who was quite brusque with his colleagues. So he is famously rude at times, especially with once he's a general officer with his fellow general officers. He just has this incredible talent for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, for offending people. He's brusque, he is abrasive, he's cold, and yet at home with his family, he's a wonderful father to his 3 kids and a wonderful husband to his wife Grace. So he has these 2 sides to him. Some interesting quotes about him. Few generals were physically tougher or more active. Relentlessly driving himself, he had little need of driving others. They were quick to follow his examples. This was someone who had worked for him as chief of staff when Kruger commanded an army pre-World War II. It was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower. Perhaps you've heard of him. So he is mentored by Kruger, and he admired Kruger, but he thought, I'm looking forward to getting away from him, too. He had worked for MacArthur, too. I think you know that, and he had endured that for about 6 years and said, I'm getting out. One of Kruger's commanders assessed, I think very insightfully, he said, he was a good soldier and a good strategist and a very sound thinker, but he didn't have much of a personality. So, very true. He wasn't going to get by on personality. In terms of his operational outlook, by 1945, certainly he's led a lot of troops in action. He has a reputation for being cautious, methodical, sensible. He's all of these things. He commands more ground combat troops than any single American commander in the war against Japan. And so at Luzon, his 6th Army leads the invasion and will dominate much of the campaign to follow. Now, the other guy is Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who commands the 8th Army. And by now, he and Kruger have developed quite a rivalry. The background on Eichelberger, he is from a much more advantaged background than was Kruger. Eichelberger was born in a comfortable, well-off home in Urbana, Ohio, to a very successful local lawyer and gentleman farmer. So Eichelberger's parents have been very much shaped by the Civil War. His father had fought for the U.S. Army, the Union side, in the Civil War. His mother was a Southerner from Mississippi, and she'd experienced the siege at Vicksburg. So Eichelberger is steeped in this tradition of the Civil War and growing up in this sort of idyllic boyhood. And he's the youngest of 5 children. He's beloved because he has, from the earliest days, this very warm personality. He's fun to be around. He has a lot of friends. He's trustworthy. He's witty. He's just a delight. Okay, but his father, and I think this is sort of a tendency of a lot of like really successful parents. Sometimes they think their kids have had it too easy, that they've made it too easy for them, and they're not going to make it in the world. And so his father felt that way about his kids, and so he's constantly trying to test them and push them to the brink. So I often said the Eichelberger family was like a reality show kind of thing, this constant competition. Imagine yourself as the youngest of 5 siblings with 3 older brothers and an older sister. How do you think you're going to do in that competition day by day? You're the baby. You have a severe disadvantage. And so no one took Bobby very seriously because he was just the little mascot, you know? And so that stayed with him. And he had then this desire to achieve, to show who he was and what he could be. And soldiering became that way he could do it. He initially attends Ohio State University for a year, eventually gets an appointment to United States Military Academy. He graduates in the class of 1909 as an infantry officer. And so he really is something of a natural soldier. He, during World War I, he did not serve in France. He's sent to Russia with the so-called Polar Bear Expedition that the Western powers and Japan sent forces to help the anti-Bolshevik side during the Russian Civil War. And Eichelberger sees combat. He's an intel officer. He gets the Distinguished Service Cross. And interestingly, he embedded with a Japanese Army unit for a while and studied them. Eichelberger was very scholarly and cerebral, but also a field soldier. Very much loved troops, extraordinarily courageous. So this sort of shapes his career on many levels, of course. He did not have any kids, but he had a soulmate, his wife Emma, and they had each other, and they had Bob's career. Eichelberger had friends all over the Army, including one, his 1909 classmate, a guy named George Patton. They were so similar in terms of their approach to warfare, their outlook operationally. They corresponded during the war, which is very interesting to see their letters back and forth, how they influenced each other. And so Eichelberger is one of these guys who has friends all over the place and is really almost universally liked. One of his friends said he was one of the most colorful and attractive individuals it's been my good fortune to meet. General Eichelberger had a rare way with people. He enjoyed people, all kinds of people. Because of his lively curiosity, vitality, and basic optimism, he never became an old man. And above all, he was honest. Eichelberger had seen a lot of combat in World War II by 1945, most notably at the Battle of Buna in 1942, in which he's the key guy for winning that battle and the invasion of Hollandia, so on and so forth. So he's a lead from the front kind of soldier. So why don't he and Kruger get along? Well, I mentioned earlier about Kruger's rudeness. Eichelberger can't fathom rudeness. To him, other people's feelings matter. So politeness, cordiality, warmth, all those things are really important. Communications, and he's had all sorts of bad experiences with Kruger, which Kruger's just honestly been a jerk to him. And Eichelberger, that bothers him. But more than that, they're different operationally. Eichelberger's way more aggressive, and he thinks that Kruger is too stodgy, too slow, too cautious. Kruger thinks Eichelberger is too nice, too solicitous with his staff and failure of those underneath him, and this is war after all, and lives are at stake, that kind of thing. Okay, so MacArthur understands the rivalry, and he will exploit that, certainly, the most that he possibly can. So the invasion of Luzon takes place on January 9th. It's called S-Day. This is the sort of overall look of it, and I think when you just sort of step back and look at this, it's a little staggering. This is 4 U.S. Army divisions are going to invade on that day on January 9th, 1945. And look at all the follow-on forces there, too. MacArthur, during this war, had constantly, shall we say, complained, that's the nicest word I could say, about how Washington wasn't giving him enough people, enough material, enough priority, enough stuff. And by now, 1945, he's got more combat power than any other U.S. command on Earth, except for Eisenhower in Europe. Okay, so he has a lot, and this campaign in the Philippines is absolutely massive, and the 4 divisions that we have invade here is more than we contribute to the Normandy invasion. Okay, so it gives you a little sense of perspective here. So, what's the job of getting ashore like? Is it easy for the fleet? No. Because the Japanese have begun kamikaze attacks by now, and they're going to launch that against Kinkaid's fleet, and they're not going to sink any ships, but they'll damage 24, and they kill 503 sailors during the run-up to this. They kill Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, who was the British liaison officer attached to MacArthur's headquarters, who was universally liked. It was a terrible tragedy. So the Japanese could inflict damage, but they couldn't stop the invasion fleet. And they expended all the planes they had in the area, and then they're going to husband the rest of them, of course, for subsequent battles of Iwo Jima and more famously Okinawa, that the kamikazes have a major effect there. So what do the Japanese have in terms of defending Luzon? They've got about 287,000 ground soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army and some of the Imperial Navy under one of their finest commanders in the war, General Yamashita. Okay, now there's three major groups that you can see that he's got in the map. He himself is somewhat isolated in the northern part of Luzon. He doesn't really have hands-on and direct communication control of all of his forces everywhere. So Yamashita understands by this point in the war, the Americans are going to get ashore. So the point should be, from a Japanese strategic perspective, to bog them down and bleed them. Okay, that's what it's come to. If you can bleed them sufficient to loosen American will to continue to unconditional surrender and an occupation of Japan and the end of the emperor, the end of the empire, whatever these doomsday scenarios are, this can provide some semblance of an outcome to the war. And I will tell you, that is not an unrealistic thing. When you're looking at the level of fighting here and the losses that the Americans are going to take and all that, this was leaving a mark on the American cultural scene. We did not have unlimited resources and people and material and economics and whatever. And so that's Yamashita's perspective. Hunker down, fight a defensive battle, and bleed them. So the four divisions get ashore fairly easily, but the real fighting, of course, is just beginning. Now 6th Army faces an enormous task of unloading freight, moving supplies, developing airfields, reconstructing roads, all that unglamorous side to the war that has to be done and is very much the Army's role. 11,000 short tons of supplies and ammo are moving across these Lingayen beaches every day. It's a major job to develop depots and rail lines. And here's the other element that really is to the Americans' favor. The Filipinos themselves are taking a leading role in their liberation. They had been from the beginning. They will be to the end. Filipino guerrillas fighting alongside the Americans, giving intel, Filipino more conventional formations, Filipino labor hired to do a lot of the work I just mentioned, Filipino civilians helping out, on and on it goes. They are major players in this whole campaign and the liberation. You talk about a force multiplier, massive, and very demoralizing to the Japanese. So here's the way it develops for Kruger's army once ashore. Now in the north, what was at that time called I Corps. Nowadays they tend to call it First Corps. I Corps is going to hold that northern flank against the possibility of a counterattack from Yamashita's forces in the north, while Major General Oscar Griswold's 14th Corps is going to make the main move for what was called Clark Field and eventually will be Clark Air Force Base someday, that complex of bases, and of course Manila itself. Okay, so MacArthur wants those objectives as quickly as possible. The invasion happens January 9th. He wants them within a week or two. But to his intense frustration, Kruger handled 14th Corps' advance with a characteristic methodical caution. Kruger's worried about his flanks. He knows there's Japanese forces on either side of him, and he knows it's possible they can come out of the hills and they can attack along that road net that we're moving on towards Manila. There are numerous river crossings. Think of all the water crossings you've got here and what that means for the engineers. There are 217 wrecked timber bridges in the 6th Army sector alone, in 14th Corps sector alone, that the engineers simply have to deal with. You can move infantry uncomfortably across some of those water sources, but not vehicles. And that all has to be dealt with. But Kruger's probably being a little too careful. He's constitutionally not really suited to embracing major risks, and MacArthur grows exasperated with him. The thing about this, and this is only an historian's point of view, a latter-year point of view, but that's partially why we're here. When you really look at the pattern of the Pacific-Asia War, when the Japanese were on the attack against the Americans, and to a great extent other Western forces, they were nowhere near as effective when they were on the defensive throughout much of the war. When they're on the defensive, that was really their asset because you got all sorts of people willing to fight to the death, and you have very, very intelligent commanders who know how to fortify and know how to fight defensive warfare. Being on offense is more complex, though. Combined arms, coordinating with artillery, coordinating with other kinds of platforms of firepower, avenues of advance, all this kind of stuff had really eluded the Japanese to some extent, and it led to disasters at Guadalcanal, Bougainville, several other places in the course of this war. So if the Japanese are going to come out of the hills to attack Kruger on either flank, from my point of view, we should welcome that, because now they've come out, and now you're going to be able to inflict massive damage on them versus trying to root them out of every cave, every bunker, every hilltop, wherever they would be in which they're fighting this defensive battle. Kruger doesn't seem to quite get that, and it's quite exasperating to MacArthur. He even locates his headquarters ahead of 6th Army headquarters to try and shame Walter into moving faster. No luck. Now, in my book, though, I really take MacArthur to task ultimately because he has miscast his actors here. If he wanted that quick push for Manila and Clark Field, which makes all kinds of sense, as I'll mention more in a moment, if he wants that, he should assign that to the more aggressive commander. Kruger is just not really that guy who's going to do this. He's your solid, by-the-book, safe, make-it-happen, sensible commander. He's not the aggressive Patton Eichelberger type. So if he wanted that, he probably should have tapped Eichelberger, and he doesn't. So why are these objectives valuable? Well, of course, obviously the airfields. Of course, that's usually why we're invading anywhere in the Pacific in World War II, to develop an airfield because of the supreme importance of air power, obviously. But Manila itself is more than just a prestige objective. Of course, it is that. It's political. It's a great city. It's the capital of the archipelago, which is about to get its independence eventually, so on and so forth. Yes, but it is also your main port and logistical node. You're talking about massive operations on this scale. You are going to need to supply all these ground units that are operating there on Luzon, and Manila is the way to do that. Okay, so it's not just a prestige objective. MacArthur will be, I think, unfairly accused by some historians later of just simply wanting it for his own vanity and his own purpose, and like by his birthday in late January. I found no evidence, by the way, no primary source evidence that he wanted it for his birthday or anything like that. No, he wants it for solid good reasons. And while it's also remarkable to me that Yamashita will later claim that he did not intend to defend Manila, this is a commander of tremendous intelligence who has the purpose of bleeding his enemy. That's the point, isn't it? Is there any better way to do that in urban combat? And you don't need to be all that good at it. You can bog them down street to street in this terrible meat grinder if you have that orientation. Yamashita will claim that he did not intend to fight in Manila, but of course we'll see a fight does develop there. So this whole thing with Kruger and Eichelberger and MacArthur, is not going the way MacArthur wants at this stage, and so he kind of tries a little end run here. He takes Eichelberger, he detaches him, as you see, so it says 8th and Eichelberger, and he gives him one division, the 11th Airborne, which is an amazing division. It is a airborne and glider-borne division of about 8,000 to 9,000 troops. That is highly trained, and he sends them into Nasugbu on January 31st, 1945, in this kind of end run. So to the north, as the map shows you, 14th Corps with 2 divisions, 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Infantry Division, both outstanding units, are moving towards Clark Field and the northern reaches of Manila, but not as quickly as we would like. So he knows, MacArthur does, that Eichelberger wants this kind of military glory, and he even tells him, Bob, you can be the Patton of the Pacific, and that definitely gets Eichelberger's attention. He's like, yes, let's go. And so he loves the idea of this end run. Now, it's often said that opposites attract. I would submit to you that the same often attracts too, and what I mean by that, the commander of the 11th Airborne Division is a guy by the name of Major General Joe Swing. He's actually a classmate of Bradley and Eisenhower in the class of 1915 at West Point. Joe Swing was an airborne pioneer, and he's really aggressive. And he and Eichelberger are like proverbial peas in a pod. You unleash these two guys, you are going to get a very, very bold and aggressive kind of approach. So you've got one airborne unit that lands behind the Japanese lines, but also in the midst of them, if that makes sense, and begins this road-bound advance with an airborne drop at Tagaytay Ridge with the orientation going toward the southern approaches to Manila. It's a 65-plus mile advance along one main supply route in which they outfight, outwit, and outthink the Japanese at pretty much every turn. The bad news, though, is that once you get to Manila in a major built-up urban area, you're now encountering some pretty formidable fortifications, especially for a lightly armed airborne unit. It's what's called the Genko line. The Japanese had expected the main American push for Manila to come from the south. So their strongest defenses tended to be on the southern part, on the Genko line. The 11th Airborne runs up against that, and it's fighting very hard in the midst of the Genko line as we're getting deeper into February 1945, and this becomes something of a dead end, which is disappointing to Eichelberger, but at the same time, he and Swing have pulled off, and the troopers especially, have pulled off something absolutely amazing here in even getting that far. But the main effort on Manila is going to come from the north, from the 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Division that are under the control of 6th Army. So, why do we end up with a fight in Manila? Well, instead of abandoning it, as MacArthur had envisioned, as apparently Yamashita had envisioned, the Japanese now turn the city into an enormous urban battleground. Okay, so what's happened here is you have cut off mostly Japanese naval forces, but some army, about a third of them are Imperial Japanese Army, but you have basically dismounted naval forces from the ships that are no longer in use, so they've taken the guns off ships, other ordnance and whatever. You've got also special naval landing forces. The Japanese Navy had its own kind of shadow army during World War II. We often erroneously call them Japanese Marines. They weren't Marines, they were sailors. So they are not really in communication with Yamashita at times, but they also don't always recognize his authority. So there's about 17 to 20,000 of them, and they decide, we're here, we're going to hunker down, and we're going to fight the Americans block to block. The commander is Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, who basically decides on that concept, and MacArthur had hoped Manila would be declared an open city, like when the Americans had been defeated in 1941, he had declared Manila an open city. He didn't want the city destroyed. So what do? Do you go in and fight block to block? Do you bypass it? Exactly what? Well, he feels he has no choice but to fight for it. So 1st Cav and 37th Division are going to fight a bitter battle to take Manila against that Japanese force. And the fighting raged room to room, house to house, block to block. Profoundly tragic. So you're basically supported by mortars, artillery, tanks, even eventually airstrikes. Now, it's incremental use of firepower because initially you don't want to destroy the buildings, the infrastructure, all this. So over time, they realize they have to use every implement of firepower. And this is very tough for MacArthur. This is his hometown. And it brings us face to face with the liberation dilemma that we have in the Philippines. We've come to the Philippines to liberate the people of the archipelago, and that means destroying a lot of the country and property and people being killed in the middle of it and all of that, the disruption, the refugees, all of that, similar to what we faced in Europe in liberating France, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, portions of Italy, whatever it would be. It's the same dilemma here. Okay, so this is the tragedy. It is an infantryman's war to a great extent. Infantry assault squads carrying Browning automatic rifles, bazookas, satchel charges, grenades, submachine guns, and flamethrowers, a lot of flamethrowers. The combat is intimate, it's bloody, it's horrifying. Let me give you an example. This is Warren Matha, a sergeant in the 5th Cavalry Regiment, an amazing unit. He remembered, kick in the door, stick in the flamethrower nozzle, roast the Japanese alive. I can still hear them screaming. I can still smell the burning flesh. The Americans sometimes even poured gasoline into Japanese-controlled buildings and simply roasted everyone inside. That was an engineer thing. Even then, according to one intel officer, the infantry soldiers had to, quote, actually enter dugouts, caverns, and pillboxes and annihilate them before resistance ceased. This kind of horrifying, traumatic intimacy really characterized the fighting. And so, of course, my apologies, this is graphic, but this is the history of what happened that we're talking about. Japanese bodies were just strewn everywhere. You're sort of advancing through the bramble here. And, this is a very typical image. To guard against ambushers playing dead, U.S. soldiers pumped bullets in the heads of nearly every corpse, then sprinkled them with lime to try and dampen their stench, and then they would line them up against walls, basically. The worst aspect of the battle might have been the tragic destruction wrought on the people of Manila in the city landscape. This is a major city of 1.1 million people, 110 square miles. Untold thousands of people were killed or wounded by the intense firepower of both sides, but especially the American side. In one climactic barrage, the Americans utilized 370,000 pounds of ordnance because you had to in order to have any force survivability. But probably the vast majority of the locals were killed by deliberate Japanese atrocities. Horrible, deliberate, savage atrocities. Iwabuchi's HQ issued an order, I found, basically saying, destroy everything. Docks, warehouses, factories, people. On the pretext that Filipinos were aiding the Americans, he and his commanders sanctioned basically killing them all. All people on the battlefield, with the exception of Japanese military personnel, Japanese civilians, will be put to death, declared that chilling order. The order even included instructions about how to dispose of the bodies and advice on how to kill without using much ammo, because they wanted to use what ammo they had against the Americans. So you see a lot of people packed into buildings that are then burned down, or people stabbed to death in intimate killings. Also some rapes. Some of the perpetrators kept ghoulish tallies about how many people they killed, using guerrilla as a euphemism for anyone Filipino. One noted that he had stabbed 10 people to death and helped burn 150 others to death. He's keeping a tally in his diary. Another soldier sadly wrote, "The innocence I possessed at the time of leaving the homeland has long since disappeared. Now I'm a hardened sinner, and my sword is stained with blood. May God forgive me, may my mother forgive me." And I really think that's incredibly poignant on many levels. Did these guys come to the archipelago to be criminals, to commit these atrocities? Could they have ever imagined they would be doing this? Most of them are ordinary guys. In this situation now, doing these things because of peer pressure, command pressure, but also a level of hatred and dehumanization that was building up on the part of the Japanese toward the Filipinos because of how pro-American they were. This is where it was leading ultimately. So he and many thousand others had really grown to hate the Filipinos and thus to sanction any kind of killing against them. Horrible, horrible thing. The Americans do the best they can. It's a humanitarian operation to try and help the survivors. Fighting finally peters out in early March, so it's a combat victory, but also a humanitarian operation now and a reclamation project. The U.S. troops counted about 16,500 Japanese bodies. The Americans lost over 1,000 killed and 5,600 wounded. And it took the engineer units months to restore the shattered harbor and begin rebuilding the shattered landscape. This is what the city looked like at the end. It's just horrifying, isn't it? Campaign in the Philippines, though, was nowhere near over. It wore on through the rest of that summer, that spring and summer 1945. 8th Army then clears out the rest of the archipelago. So Eichelberger gets the assignment. Remember I mentioned earlier the 35-plus amphibious invasions in the spring and summer 1945? Okay, so everything you see south of Manila, except for Leyte and a few other islands, Eichelberger's 8th Army is going to be invading and liberating throughout much of that time frame. It is a remarkable thing. The level of planning, the coordination, the logistics, the combat leadership is on par with the finest in the history of the U.S. Armed Forces. He liberates something on the order of about 7 million people in the space of a few months at the cost of about 2,000 dead, 7,000 wounded, outfights, outthinks the Japanese more or less everywhere. And again, the Filipinos are such a huge part of this whole thing. So why don't we really know about this? Because in a way, it's strategically pointless. You're going backwards, and so it's really lost before history, what is in some ways Eichelberger's ultimate masterpiece, and this is, of course, a major point of frustration to him, as you might imagine. But if you're interested in studying amphibious operations and excellent, bold, maneuver-oriented leadership, coordination with guerrillas, and inter-service coordination and all that, take a look at this campaign, because it really is amazing. Meanwhile, the fighting continued on Luzon. This grinding, attritional fighting that went on for the rest of the war. Day after day, soldiers fighting in the jungles, in this kind of environment. Really interesting image here, I think, because you'll notice the guy in front, that is a Filipino guide. And then you can see the American soldiers behind him, probably an infantry unit, and that's the kind of terrain they're operating in. Often ill-equipped, subsisting on maybe a K ration or two per day, if that. Conditions were appalling: heat, insects, rain, mud, privation, disease, combat fatigue, usual battles of annihilation against the Japanese. I mean, it just seemed to go on forever. The violence of it all was appalling, and of course the terrain. This is the terrain you're dealing with. Imagine yourself operating in this environment. and having to get results and gain ground and do it quickly and coordinate your firepower, keep your people supplied. I mean, it's really, really staggering. I'll give you one microcosmic example. In 4 months on the line, the 130th Infantry, 33rd Division, expended some 44,000 mortar shells, 6,400 105 millimeter self-propelled rounds, 30,000 hand grenades, and about 1.4 million machine gun bullets. That's one regiment, one part of the line, 4 months. Think of what that takes to supply and what that means for the intensity of the fighting. Regimental staff calculated the expenditure of, on average, 300 pounds of ordnance for every casualty inflicted on the Japanese. 300 pounds of ordnance. 6th Army overall expended about 12,000 plus artillery shells per day. It was absolutely just unreal. Definitely an infantryman's fight. They suffered about 90% of the casualties. So Kruger's 6th Army reported about 38,000 battle casualties in the Luzon campaign. But I would submit to you, and that included about 8,100 fatalities, I would submit to you that that's disingenuous. Actually, when you really look at the casualty rates, Kruger's 6th Army suffered about 93,400 casualties because there were, in addition to wounded and killed, there's missing, there's disease that are related to combat. You have malaria, you have immersion foot, you've got dengue fever, whatever it be. You're not getting that just hanging out in the rear somewhere, okay? It's because you're in combat. And also, of course, combat fatigue, which is siphoning off a lot of manpower in this kind of environment. So this is enormously costly. And I think really on par with the attritional fighting that's happening to Eisenhower's armies, in 1944 and 45, Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864, Argonne Forest in World War I, all the above. So where does it all end? Of course, Yamashita does not actually surrender until after the famous ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. So to him, this meant honor resolved. Because he's got, his holdouts in the northern part of Luzon. You see that little finger of little drip of a perimeter that he's got, but they do hang on. By that time, by late 1945, if you're a Japanese soldier in part of his command at that point, the greater threat to your life really is disease or starvation rather than American ordnance. And there was a lot of American ordnance, as we know. So he has salvaged that somewhat intact, and then he surrenders, of course. So in the wake of that formal surrender now, hundreds of thousands of Japanese servicemen will lay down their arms over the vast expanse of their empire that you have not necessarily conquered. So you wonder why we stopped short of the 100% unconditional surrender, why the Americans and their allies decide, let's leave Emperor Hirohito in place. One glance at that map should give you a sense of that. These are all the places that remained under Japanese control, including major portions of China, obviously, where the next fight was amping up at the Chinese Civil War. So you're talking about an enormous repatriation effort. By the end of 1946, some 3.2 million military personnel and nearly 2.8 million civilians had surrendered and in most instances were repatriated back to Japan. And, of course, it's the U.S. Army taking the lead in that. So the American victory, of course, comes at a fearful cost. Some 111,606 Americans were killed or went missing in the war against Japan. And the plurality of these deaths, as I mentioned, were Army ground soldiers. If you were one of them, you had a 2.3% chance of dying in the war among the 1.8 million who served. So those whose remains had been recovered were now scattered among 133 cemeteries all over the Pacific and Asia. There were 9 in China, there were 55 in Burma and India. And so overworked graves registration teams had buried them as carefully and respectfully and professionally as they possibly could in the context of ongoing operations. You can imagine what a horrible and thankless job this truly was. Some stared wide-eyed. One of these graves registration soldiers recalled of burying the bodies. Others had died in the middle of a scream and their mouths hung open. Others had no face at all. The work was nightmarish, and it ate at our hearts. I can imagine that. On May 16, 1946, the Congress passed a law creating the Return of the World War II Dead program, an attempt to recover and repatriate as many of the dead as possible. And I would say the very existence of this program epitomized the country's wealth and its Republican, small r, commitment to the value of its citizens' lives. that the individual was supposed to matter. It also reflected almost universal American values about the importance of recovering corporeal remains as tangible commemorative symbols of the mourned. Next of kin then had to make the decision whether to return the remains of their loved ones or leave them in place at an American Battle Monuments Commission cemetery somewhere around the globe. So you can imagine, too, this must have led to anguish, grief-stricken arguments. Family members disagree. Who's the key decision maker? How's it all going to work? Who makes the ultimate call? Well, you had to fill out Army Quartermaster Form 345 and turn it into the government. And by 1947, the families have largely done this. About 61% elected to have them brought home. So now think of the enormous effort this is going to take. Just as the Army had done so much fighting in all over the globe, it now took the lead in carrying out this repatriation program. There were about 13,000 Army soldiers involved all over the planet, guys who were part of teams like this, recovery teams, spreading far and wide, literally to the ends of the earth, sometimes in very dangerous places, to recover the dead from small graves like you see here, or temporary cemeteries like you see there. The job was exacting, almost ghoulish. Similar to the way the Americans had fought the war, they expended huge amounts of equipment and materiel. Crews sprayed a powdery hardening compound into body cavities to minimize stench and fluid leakage. One of the things I found in the records, they documented, okay, well, here's the average, 2 to 5 pounds of compound per body, 1 gallon of deodorant spray per 20 bodies, 1 pair of gloves for every 3 to 5 bodies. That's the equipment they are expending as they recover the remains. By late summer 1947, they had recovered and processed 72,252 remains. So there were about 31,000 in Manila, killed obviously mostly in the Philippines, 3,500 in Calcutta, 23,000 plus on Saipan, not all killed on Saipan, but in other islands around the Central Pacific, and over 2,000 in Yokohama, Japan. What was the story with them? Mainly POWs who had died, but also downed aviators. And at last, on September 30th, 1947, the first set of 3,027 remains were ready for return aboard this ship, U.S. Army transport Honda Knot, 4,000-ton Liberty ship, and there would follow 10 other Army funeral ships in the wake of Honda Knot. The crew of Honda Knot had meticulously cleaned the ship, lathered it with a fresh coat of paint for these very distinguished guests. And the remains are now ensconced in steel caskets. 10 days later, in this image that you're seeing here, on October 10th, 1947, Honda Knot majestically glided under the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco Bay. A cannon boomed in the distance. The ship dropped anchor opposite Marina Green, where hundreds of people had gathered for a somber memorial service. The group included the mayor, the Secretary of the Navy, and General Mark Clark. Port crews unloaded the now flag-draped caskets and loaded them onto specially fitted rail cars for transportation to their various destinations. Telegrams were then sent by Army authorities to the next of kin, informing them of the imminent arrival of their loved one. Think of all the coordination of that. Make sure it's right. Make sure you're communicating accurately with the family at every turn. Each casket was escorted by a specially trained serviceman of equal or higher rank to the deceased. These are not random people, carefully chosen and trained. Many of them, of course, World War II veterans, combat experience. They are the face of the government, interacting with the family now and everything that means, forming strong bonds at times, but also on the receiving end of some pretty serious grief. So the Army had established 15 major distribution centers around the country that read like a travelogue of America. San Francisco, Mira Loma, California, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Kansas City, Columbus, Ohio, Philadelphia, New York City, and Charlotte, to name just a few. And before groups large and small, major cities, small towns, remote outposts alike, everywhere, caskets were ceremoniously buried with full military honors wherever the next of kin chose them to be buried. The price was $564.50 per funeral that the government would pay. 78% of the deceased were buried in a private cemetery or family plot, the rest in a national military cemetery like you see here. Among those now interred in their home soil were many thousands of Army soldiers from every corner of the Pacific-Asia War. I'll give you a few examples. Private James Henson of the 192nd Tank Battalion, who died at Berry Berry as a POW, captured in the Philippines in 1942. Sergeant Frank Simmons, who died in the South Pacific of pneumonia. You could die of disease anywhere, including the South Pacific. PFC Norman Petschauer, killed in action with the 27th Infantry Division on Saipan in the summer of 1944. PFC Louis Profeta, he was once captain of his high school football team. He had been killed in action at Buna, the battle I mentioned that Alkelberger had led in 1942. Sergeant John Zangerly, 37th Infantry Division, killed in the ferocious fighting at Manila that we discussed today. Lieutenant Buford Cooper, killed in a vehicle accident in Burma on the Stilwell Road, the supply route to China that the Allies laboriously created in the course of the war. Killed in a traffic accident, something as innocuous as that. And PFC Monroe Hicks of Sikeston, Missouri, whose hometown paper referred to him as both a returning hero and a, quote, colored soldier, reflecting the realities of the time of racial segregation. In 1951, after 4 years in the shipment home of over 171,000 Americans from Europe, Asia, Pacific, the expenditure of nearly $164 million, the return of the World War II dead repatriation program officially ended. But the mourning never really did. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, John, for that fascinating and actually overwhelming presentation. I'm Walt Hudson, and I'll be the moderator for a few minutes. So at this time, we invite students to the microphones to ask any questions that you might have. And I want to offer just two quick reminders. First, when asking a question, identify yourself and provide a name. And just remember, Chatham House rules apply. And as we wait for questions, let me ask you, John, a question I have talking about the Philippines campaign. There's a lot of controversy about General Yamashita and his handling of Manila. And, of course, he was tried as a war criminal after the war. What's your take on his culpability regarding Manila?
Right. So MacArthur will end up blaming Yamashita for the horrible atrocities in Manila. I want to make very clear, Yamashita never ordered these atrocities, would not have wanted them, and there is no evidence that really links him in that direct line. However, of course, soldiers and sailors who were under his military command technically did commit these atrocities, including a two-star rear admiral who basically orders these atrocities. And so I guess under the precept of you're responsible for everything that happens under your command, whether you order it or not, he is basically laid down with guilt over this. MacArthur will see to it that he is prosecuted and ultimately executed. His chief of staff, too, will be executed as well. I think it sets a tough legal precedent that for a commander that literally anything that escapes your purview or whatever, outside your control, regardless, you are still going to be blamed for that. Now, I'm not saying this, but there are some who believe that MacArthur was doing this because to get even with Yamashita for hanging on throughout the summer of 1945 and never really being defeated, as many Japanese would see it, in the Philippines. I don't know, but there's no question that MacArthur needed a scapegoat and that Yamashita was that guy. I think it's problematic legally, but I'm not necessarily a lawyer.
Question over here.
Good morning. Patty Fernandez, Air Force, College of Information and Cyberspace. Given your extensive research on World War II and its key battles, what do you believe is often the most overlooked or misunderstood aspect of the conflict, especially in terms of its impact on modern military strategy or geopolitics?
Yeah, I mean, I really think the most misunderstood aspect of it is the idea of the war against Japan is really a maritime war, as that's the full bore of this thing. Certainly, that's a major part of it, but in the end, at least as I see it, it was in some respects about controlling ground. And controlling ground perhaps to build airfields because of the projection of air power and whatever else, yes. But controlling ground mattered a lot. And I think if that was true then, it's likely to be true now or in the future or whatever, with human beings being terrestrial creatures. And so the reason I think it's important to understand The Army's role in the Pacific is to understand that if you wanted influence in that 1/3 of the world's surface, and that we were looking at on the map earlier, you basically needed ground power. And you needed, of course, obviously combined power, but ground power ultimately to have influence and control ground, and in this case, advance towards Japan and do wherever else. I think, in a way, that's the misnomer, and it's great to study the hardcore of, the Battle of Midway ins and outs of this carrier and that carrier and whatever else, but ultimately, none of this was going to matter much if we didn't actually control the island itself, if we didn't, advance from there, to other places. I mean, so... I really think the reason I point this out is how crucially important inter-service teamwork was then and would be and always. So everybody bringing their skill sets. So it's just, I guess when you look at the European war, it's just easier to think of it as a land war, as a continental littoral war, because these vast spaces. The Pacific isn't that different in the sense that once we're on the ground, the nature of the fighting is really pretty similar.
Go ahead, next question, please.
Good morning, sir. Thank you so much for coming. Axel Gonzalez, Intel Officer, United States Air Force with the mighty College of Information and Cyberspace. My question is, I took a look at your map, and it reminded me a lot of Warden and his 5 rings, in that particularly air power could access that strategic center of gravity without having to chew up everything else, which is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of square miles. Do you think nowadays, because of the involvement of potential conflict with nuclear powers, that perhaps instead of relying on things like air power, we need to take a look at informational power and see how that can have similar access to those strategic effects without having to chew up infantrymen across many square miles?
Absolutely. I mean, informational power is power on so many levels. I mean, there's so many dimensions to that, isn't there? I mean, so one of the reasons we have such influence in the Philippines is informational power, in the sense of, involving Filipinos and being part of that and outreach with them. MacArthur's headquarters is very good at working with guerrillas and also then communicating once MacArthur's forces have landed on Leyte in 1944, so on and so forth. But informational power in terms of understanding what the enemy's intentions are, too. Okay, so obviously the famous code breaking in World War II, I think, is very analogous to this. And I think that saves untold numbers of lives then, so I don't know why it would be any different now. The greater you are in the informational sphere, what we think of the cyber sphere now too, the greater you shape attitudes, you get your message out there, but also the more understanding you have of the operational space, I think. So I'll give you an example just from the Pacific War. The Australians in 1943 capture an abandoned Imperial Japanese Army code book that really becomes sort of like the Rosetta Stone on some levels for decoding a lot of Japanese communications, which then is a force multiplier in terms of MacArthur launching the Hollandia invasion in April 1944, which is a game changer in the South Pacific War. And so how many lives did that save? So I think it's very, very analogous in that respect.
We have time for one more question over this side.
Thank you. Commander Ollie Hanks from the Royal Navy, United Kingdom, the Eisenhower School. Can you maybe expand a bit on how the experiences of junior officers or junior leaders in this war shaped how they behaved or fought in wars in the decades after, please?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, excellent question. One of the most interesting things I found in the research was a letter written by a guy who had been a battalion commander in this war and is a 2-star general in 1965 in Vietnam. And he's writing to one of his mentors and saying, I'm just amazed that we're right back in the same situation. We're right back fighting in the jungle like we were in 1943 and 1944. So what he was trying to do, he was trying to inform his the way he was going to approach Vietnam with how he had fought the jungle war. And I think in terms of like the combat level, the Americans replicate that reasonably well because they're thinking in terms of kinetic fight and bringing all the combined, firepower that you've got, which makes total sense. The game changer in Vietnam is the civil element and the guerrilla element and the hearts and minds and all that. So you could get away with that approach if you're fighting in the Philippines where the population wants you there and is willing to suffer those losses. If you're fighting in a contested sort of pacification guerrilla war, it was somewhat different. So it was very vexing to him. I think largely that generation of officers found themselves in charge of a fight in Vietnam that was tough for them. to come to terms with, even though some of them had experience in World War II. In relation to Korea, it was, of course, certainly more of a conventional war, but also not just that, because it was a guerrilla war too on some levels. So I don't, they don't seem to have learned enough maybe from the experience to carry it forward a decade or so later. But I'm only as a generality, though. I'm sure we could find exceptions.
John, thanks again very much. Another round of applause for our
Thanks.
speaker. And I'll turn it over to our commandant of the Eisenhower School for last words. Over to you, sir.
Sir, thank you very much, and also thank you to the Friends of the World War II Memorial. Thank you very much for co-sponsoring this incredible event. What a great lecture. I'm awed. I did not realize the scale and scope of Luzon, the campaign in Luzon, right? We're very much focused on, of course, I'll be biased. Iwo Jima is the greatest, amphibious landing. But nonetheless, we're focused on, usually the North African and European campaigns, and that's an incredible campaign that you've outlined, and I hopefully have spurred on a lot of interest with our students. Sir, just a small token of our appreciation from the National Defense University President Admiral Garvin, and of course the students, faculty, and staff of this great university. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you. That concludes the presentation.